Richard Kuklinski was a serial killer, was a hitman for the mob, and you're going to learn about him. And that's all the intro I have. It's Our Weird World.
Our Weird World.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and, glad you're here after, last week's Black History Month extravaganza. Good to see that you're not so offended and so angry and butthurt and guilty feeling because you're probably white that you decided you couldn't come back. And so, appreciate it. Glad you're here. This week we're getting back into the regular stuff, just learning about terrible people from history. And this one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, Richard Kuklinski. A lot of people, I don't know that a lot of people actually consider him a serial killer because the majority of his killings were actually contract killings for the mob. And so for some reason that kind of makes it different. And I'm not entirely sure why, but let's jump into his story right now. Richard Kuklinski was born on April 11th, 1935 to Stanley and Anna Kuklinski, who were coincidentally two of the worst parents ever. Stanley was an abusive alcoholic and Anna was an abusive Catholic. So usually you just hear about, the husband being the abusive one, but really in this case, both the husband and wife were both incredibly abusive. For example, Anna actually tried to stab Stanley to death. I guess it's just one of those, violently passionate marriages. Because Catholics, they're ride or die. They're not going to divorce you if they can avoid it. Stanley's abuse, on the other hand, typically involved him coming home drunk from the bar, wrapping a belt around his fist, and then just wailing on everybody. Excuse me. I'm just going to leave that in. Richard actually got so scared of his father that he just began wetting himself out of fear, and then he got beaten for wetting himself, and I accidentally just raked the windscreen of the mic with my nose. This is a good start to the episode. Anyway, the abuse from Stanley got so bad that Stanley actually beat Richard's brother Florian to death. Like, Stanley literally murdered one of his own children. However, Stanley never got in trouble for this because the family was able to cover it up by claiming that Florian, the clumsy little scamp, had just fallen down the stairs. I'm guessing, I've never fallen down the stairs, and I've never seen someone shortly after they've fallen down the stairs, but I'm guessing, you fall down enough stairs the right way, it could look like you were also physically beaten. So, whatever, it worked out for them. Anna's weapon of choice was usually a broom handle, and she also believed that a preposterously strict religious upbringing went well with beating kids with broomsticks. And so the Kuklinski children, at least the ones that weren't murdered, ended up spending their childhood raised in the Roman Catholic Church. And because Anna was such a devout Catholic, like I said, she refused to consider divorcing Stanley, even after he began bringing other women home and having sex with them in the living room while Anna and the children were upstairs in their rooms and awake and could hear it happening. It's just crazy. After Stanley and Anna had their fourth mistake child in 1944, because let's be honest, every kid those two had was just a gigantic mistake. Stanley left the family in 1944 and began living with another woman that he was having an affair with. And in response, 9-year-old Richard began rounding up the stray cats in the neighborhood, tying their tails together, and then tossing them over a clothesline, like you see pairs of tennis shoes hanging over power lines. And he would just watch the cats claw each other to death, and he found this incredibly entertaining. He also found stray dogs and doused them in gasoline and set them on fire. He would find other animals, squirrels, rabbits, birds, and just beat them to death with pipes and hammers. When Richard wasn't getting beaten by his parents or he wasn't torturing animals, he was getting beaten and bullied by the kids in school. And so with all of the violence going on in his life, Richard became intensely interested in true crime stories, which, a red flag for me because I'm intensely interested in true crime stories. If you're listening to this, you're also probably extremely interested in true crime stories. What does that say about us? Nothing. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. Richard enjoyed the thought of violent criminals getting what they deserved, which, fit Richard's dreams pretty well, considering he spent his entire childhood getting beaten by his parents and every other kid in school. He wanted, he longed for the day that, his bullies and his tormentors would get the justice that he felt they deserved. And that really plays into what he became as an older adult. Outside of his parents, Richard's biggest tormentor was a kid named Charlie Lane. And Charlie was the de facto leader of a gang of kids from the projects. And Charlie took great pride in making Richard's life miserable. And all this happened in the New York City area, by the way. In 1948, when Richard was 13, he finally decided to fight back against Charlie. And that was a bad idea because Richard was almost beaten to death because of it. But Richard was done just lying down and being a punching bag for these other bullies. And so when he recovered from, that really severe beating, he grabbed a closet rod from his house and waited outside the entrance to the project complex that Charlie lived in. And when Charlie eventually arrived home, Richard leapt from his hiding place and blasted Charlie across the side of his head with the rod. And when Charlie hit the ground, Richard pounced on top of him and beat Charlie to death at 13 years old. And horrifying upon the realization of what he'd just done, Richard then used the knowledge he'd gained from reading true crime stories, and he stole a car, threw Charlie in the trunk, and then drove out to an isolated marshland in New Jersey. He knew from the stories that police could use fingerprints and dental records to identify a body. So Richard took a hammer and a hatchet to smash out Charlie's teeth and chop off his fingers. And then he dumped the body in the marsh and deposited the teeth and the fingers in another place, which is like crazy that a 13-year-old kid had this sort of, wherewithal to, do this sort of thing. A few years later, Richard had completely changed his reputation. He was no longer the pushover that he was as a kid. Instead, he was the leader of a gang called Coming Up Roses, which, whatever, kid gangs, dumb names. They made their money robbing liquor stores, burglarizing wealthy homes, and raiding, massive warehouses. A local mafia family, the Cavalcante family, who actually is what The Sopranos were based on, heard about this gang and then offered them a job, which was a contract killing. Richard happily accepted, but the other four members of the gang were like, "Hey, all right, Richard, come on, we're doing good, robbing liquor stores and, burglarizing homes. I don't think we should be killing nobody." I don't know why they talk like that. I don't know. That's a bad New York accent. Richard, though, was like, totally on board with it. And I mean, he immediately grabbed the gun, walked up to the target, and fired at the back of his head, killing him instantly. The other gang members marveled at Richard's cold-blooded murder, and after returning to the crime boss, each member was given $500, which, probably should have all gone to Richard, but, he was a good guy. He let his gang friends have their money as well, and they all went on about it. Richard actually became a personal favorite of Carmine Genovese, the unofficial leader of the Cavalcante family. And by 1954, Richard had killed 4 more people: a police officer that he had burned alive, 2 members of Coming Up Roses that Carmine ordered to be killed just because, like, he literally just killed 2 members of his own gang. And he also killed an annoying hobo that had gotten too deep into Richard's personal space. Like, homeless people in New York, they'll get like right in your face, and Richard was just not having any of that, and he just killed him. But Richard wasn't just spending all of his time killing people. In 1959, he actually got married to his girlfriend, Linda, shortly after the two had their first child together. And Richard, following in his father's footsteps, was adamant that Linda get an abortion and even punched her in the stomach when she refused to do so. And so because that didn't work, Richard Jr. was born. And then the next year, the two had another son named David. Not surprisingly, that marriage went south real fast. And one night, Richard's brother called to tell Richard that he had seen Linda go into room 16 of the Hudson Hotel with another man. Richard immediately drove over to the hotel, kicked down the door, and just beat the man senseless, broke as many of the dude's bones as he possibly could. And then, I don't know why, this, I don't know why he had to do this, but then Richard knocked Linda out and he sliced her nipples off because, I mean, that's a reasonable thing to do when someone cheats on you, right? You know, probably not. You know, maybe you just are like, hey, all right, this didn't work. We'll see you later. You know, you don't slice someone's nipples off. That's insane. After that, Richard didn't see much of that family anymore. And, you know, that's shocking, but it is what it is. In 1961, Richard took a job at the Swift Line Trucking Company. And when he was there, he met Barbara Pedrici, an 18-year-old learning how to be the company's, you know, sole accountant, which is nuts. That you got to go to college and, you know, to be a bookkeeper and the sole accountant for a pretty big company, you know, you probably should be at least like late 20s, early 30s, if that. And even then, that's probably a questionable decision. But this girl is just learning how to do all the books at age 18. Richard first ran into Barbara at the soda machine and he began flirting with her. And Richard's boss, who thought Barbara kind of reminded him of his own daughter, warned Richard to stay away from her. And Richard defiantly told him he'd talk to whoever he wanted, and in response, he got fired for that. But Richard, who was pretty good at killing people at that point, put the boss on his extensive list of people that he wanted to kill. And when he returned the next day to pick up his final paycheck, Barbara felt absolutely terrible that that was my finger that just popped. Barbara felt terrible that she had gotten Richard fired and asked if he would be interested in grabbing coffee when she got off work. And, you know, that played right into Richard's hands. And, you know, after the two met for coffee, Richard forgot all about murdering his former boss and absolutely fell in love with Barbara. But Barbara was young. I mean, she was 18. Richard was, I don't even know at this point, 1961, you know, almost 30. He was a few years older than her. And Barbara was young. She wanted to date other boys. And when she told Richard that, he did not take that well. And I'm sure that's highly surprising to you. And so as the two sat in Richard's car, he just kind of put his arm around Barbara for what she thought was just going to be some gentle cuddle time. Instead, she felt just the slightest prick in her neck. And when she started to feel blood running down her back, she realized that Richard had actually just stabbed her with a knife. And understandably, Barbara lost her mind, and Richard responded by telling her that he would kill her entire family if she ever left him, and then he proceeded to beat her unconscious. And so the two got married and had 3 kids. And that's not a joke. That's exactly what happened. It's insane. So while Richard adjusted to being a family man again, he spent his free time working as a gang member and murdering more people. By now, he had severed ties with the DeCavalcante family and actually begun working with the Gambinos and Roy DeMeo. And his work there included staging robberies and making counterfeit copies of pornographic movies. Why that's a huge industry in the 1960s mafia, I don't know. At one point, DeMeo just pointed out a random person who was walking their dog along the street, and DeMeo ordered Richard to get out of the car and shoot him, you know, just probably thinking that Richard probably wouldn't do it, but Richard didn't hesitate and just immediately shot the man in the back of the head. But Richard didn't just enjoy murdering people with guns. You know, he used knives, tire irons, explosives, poison, even his bare hands for the exercise. And that's literally what he said. Sometimes he would just beat people to death with his bare hands just to get a good workout. When the time came to dispose of the bodies, Richard often dumped them in oil drums, fed them to rats living in a nearby cave, or placed them in cars and had them crushed in a junkyard. He even became an expert at freezing his victims' faces to disguise their time of death, which earned him the nickname of the Iceman. Richard even claimed to know, side note here, he even claimed to know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, who was the famed murder union leader that no one can ever seem to find. It's like one of the biggest mysteries in the country. Richard claimed that Hoffa was stuffed in a barrel and then set on fire for about an hour before being buried in a junkyard. He then claimed that the drum was dug up later, placed in the trunk of a car, and then the car was compacted into a 4x2 foot prism and shipped to Japan as scrap metal. Is it true? Who knows? Maybe. No one can seem to find him, and that seems like as logical of a story as anything else. By the 1980s, though, Richard was starting to get sloppy with his murders. On December 27th, 1982, the body of Gary Smith was discovered under the bed in the under a bed in the York Motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. Richard had initially tried to poison Smith with cyanide, but when it took too long for Smith to die, Richard had his associate Daniel Deppner strangle him with the lamp cord. Excuse me. When Deppner's ex-wife failed to bring the getaway car so they could dump the body, they decided to cram it between the mattress and the box spring and get out. Now, look, as smart as Richard Kuklinski was, the fact that you would rely on your associate's ex-wife to bring the getaway car for a guy that you just murdered seems really sloppy. Like, look, I'm on good terms with most of my exes. We'll say most. I still wouldn't trust any of them to help me in a murder plot to bring me a getaway car. Like, they're the last people I pick. All right. Like, I would get a cop to bring me a getaway car before I even like trusted an ex-girlfriend to help me out there. Like, it's a bad move. But with another problem here, Deppner was aware of Richard's murderous habits, and so it made sense that Deppner wouldn't last much longer either. And coincidentally, Deppner's body was found 5 months later by a cyclist in a wooded area near West Milford. Deppner's body had been put inside a green garbage bag, and a vulture had actually pried it open and begun scavenging the remains. So again, like, he's getting really sloppy here. Rather than burying it, he just tosses it in a bag, and now wildlife is opening the bag and scavenging it. On September 25th, 1983, Louis Masgay was found near a town park in Orangetown, New York, with a bullet hole in his head. And although the body had been stored in an industrial freezer for 2 years, Richard hadn't completely thawed it out before he had attempted to dump it. And this allowed the medical examiner to start putting the pieces together. So along with Gary Smith, Deppner, and Masgay, 2 other men were last reported as being seen with Richard. And all that evidence, that was just all the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms needed to launch a manhunt on Richard. So these 5 people, they disappeared. Their last reported sighting was with Richard. And at that point, they kind of put the pieces together. It's pretty obvious that Richard had killed them all. So Special Agent Dominic Polifrone. It's like, these are the most Italian names ever. Special Agent Dominic Polifrone began working with Phil Solimene, a close friend of Richard's. And Dominic finally was able to get close enough to Richard to where he was able to ask him to see if he could hire Richard for a hit. He recorded Richard talking about how he would use cyanide to carry out the contract. And then finally, Dominic arranged to meet Richard on December 17th, 1986, to give him the dose of cyanide that he needed to carry out the hit. That day, Richard took the cyanide and walked off by himself. And, as he normally did, he tested the cyanide on a stray dog to see how strong it was. But when the dog didn't die, Richard decided to back out of the hit and go home. Like, his spidey senses were up. This felt weird. So he's like, I'm going to just back out and I'm going to go home. Unfortunately, he was stopped at a roadblock that, the ATF had set up for him, and he was arrested. In March 1988, Richard was finally convicted of 5 counts of murder and given consecutive life sentences, and he died in prison on March 5th, 2006. So there you go. Richard Kuklinski, mafia hitman extraordinaire, just generally terrible person. Like, abusive husband, grew up with a tough life, but, doesn't excuse it. Just a terrible human being. And so other than that, let's see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, apparently you can beat a child to death and then claim it fell down the stairs, and I guess it looks close enough that people probably aren't going to question you about it. Number 2, please do not tie cats' tails together and then throw them over a clothesline and then watch them claw each other to death. That's just mean. And number 3, even though we didn't really cover this, Richard actually claimed, even though he was only charged with 5 murders, he actually claimed to have killed anywhere between 100 to 250 people. Unfortunately, he died in 2006 in prison, and so we'll probably never know how many people he actually ended up killing. Next week on Our Weird World, it's going to be one of those really bad episodes. It is the story of Fred West and his terrible wife, Rosemary, who were just probably the worst parents of all time. Like you think Richard Kuklinski's parents were bad, the Wests are they may be the worst, combined. There are going to be some stories later where one parent was pretty awful, but dude, the tag team that these parents did was awful, and we're unfortunately going to learn about it next week. So get ready for that. Thank you for listening. Keep telling all your friends and keep it